Yeah, well, we're going to turn now to Yemen. The Obama administration is coming under new scrutiny this week for its role in the imprisonment of a prominent Yemeni journalist who helped expose how the United States was behind a 2009 bombing in Yemen that killed 14 women and 21 children. In January 2011, a Yemeni state security court gave the journalist Abdulelah Haidar Shaye a 5-year jail sentence on terrorism-related charges following a disputed trial that was condemned by several human rights and press freedom groups. Prior to his arrest, Abdulelah Haidar Shaye broke a number of important stories about al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And he did that the last known interview with Anwar al-Awlaki just before it was revealed that Awlaki, a U.S.-born cleric, was on a CIA hit list. While Shaye often appeared on Al Jazeera and his investigative work was used by international journalists, in the eyes of the United States, he was a terrorist.
Within a month of Abdulelah Haidar Shaye's sentencing, then Yemeni President Ali Abdullah Saleh announced he was going to pardon the journalist. But Saleh changed his mind after a phone call from President Obama. According to a White House readout, Obama, quote, expressed concern over the release of Shaye. 13 months later, the journalist remains locked up. Joining us now is Jeremy Scahill, national security correspondent for The Nation magazine, author of the best-selling book Blackwater, The Rise of the World's Most Powerful Mercenary Army, and Democracy Now! Correspondent. We're also joined by Mohammed Abdel-Dayem, coordinator of the Middle East and North Africa program at the Committee to Protect Journalists. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Jeremy, you're just recently back from Yemen. Talk about Shaye, just who he is and how you learned about his case.
Well, I learned about his case because of the bombing of al-Majlah in December of 2009. You'll recall it was the first time that President Obama, that we know of, authorized a U.S. strike against Yemen. And when the strike initially happened, the United States' position was to say nothing. There were some anonymous officials that had leaked some information to news networks indicating that the U.S. was behind the bombing. But the official position was that it was a Yemeni strike and that an al-Qaeda camp had been targeted and that 34 members of al-Qaeda had been killed. Then Amnesty International obtained photographs of Tomahawk cruise missiles and cluster bombs from the scene and pictures and video of the bodies of dead women and children. And Amnesty International then determined that it had to have been a U.S. strike because Yemen didn't have those missiles and didn't have those cluster bombs, and that, in fact, among the victims of that strike were a tremendous number of women and children. Well, the individual who provided that documentary evidence to to Amnesty International and to Al Jazeera and other networks was Abdulelah Haidar Shaye. And he also came to international prominence following the Fort Hood shooting, where Major Nidal Hassan shot up and killed more than a dozen of his colleagues on a U.S. Army base in Texas. Abdulelah Haidar was the first journalist to interview Anwar al-Awlaki, who was a U.S. citizen and is sort of characterized as a radical cleric. Of course, he was killed in a U.S. drone strike last September. I bring that up and mention that because if you look at Haidar's interview with al-Awlaki, it actually was a pretty objective interview. He pushed back on al-Awlaki. He pointed out contradictions of previous statements of al-Awlaki. He said to him, how can you support the killing of Hassan's fellow Americans? Haidar worked with ABC News. The Washington Post paid his expenses for him to go and do an interview with al-Awlaki. He was identified by the New York Times as an al-Qaeda expert. And all of a sudden then you find him becoming the target of the Saleh regime. And he is arrested the first time in July of 2010, kidnapped off the streets, taken and interrogated, threatened, told by Yemeni intelligence officials, stop talking about the Majlah bombing. He's released onto the streets in the middle of the night and then immediately goes over to Al Jazeera and does an interview on Al Jazeera and continues talking out.
Well, interestingly, the Obama administration is claiming that he is a terrorist, that he was assisting al-Qaeda, but you also talk about why he was able to get such access to key opposition figures to the U.S. government. Could you talk about that and his unusual access to some of these figures?
Right. Abdulelah Haidar Shaye is by marriage related to a sort of prominent jihadist cleric Abdulmajid Zindani, who is a U.S. Treasury Department designated terrorist and the founder of Iman University in Yemen. And a lot of sort of now internationally famous jihadists have gone through that university, and he was someone who was of interest to the U.S. for a long time. And so because of his relationship with Zindani, he was given access to a world that a lot of journalists are not able to gain access to. But it's important to also point out that Abdulelah Haidar was not just a mouthpiece for these al-Qaeda figures. He was very critical of conservative Salafist movements in Yemen. He also did critical reporting about Zindani, his own relative, and was, was a sort of fiercely independent character. And so when he was tried, eventually, first of all, he was abducted for 30 days and disappeared. His family didn't know where he was. The government didn't acknowledge it. He was arrested in a house raid. No one knew where he was taken. When he finally was brought to trial, he was tried in a court that was set up by a presidential decree in Yemen with the explicit intent to go after journalists who were criticizing the regime. And his lawyers say that the evidence against him included fabricated correspondence taken from a computer that did not belong to Abdulelah Haidar, that was not on the initial evidence list. And his trial was widely condemned around the world. In fact, he refused to present a defense because he said, I don't recognize the legitimacy of this court.
And when he was subsequently arrested and then his actual trial, can you talk about the procedures of that trial itself?
Yeah, the trial does not pass the laugh test at all. And the court does not pass the laugh test. There's no transparency. There's no proper appeals process. Lawyers are deprived of a lot of the files. Things are slid in last minute. It just failed to meet those standards. And this is not just my opinion, but this was observed by every single person who attended these sessions when they were allowed to attend.
See, this is what's important to realize here. What's important to realize here, and what Mohammed is saying, is that on one side of this, you have major media freedom organizations. You have major human rights organizations, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International. You have every legal and human rights organization in Yemen. You have very prominent foreign correspondents who've spoken out on this case, some of whom knew Abdulelah Haidar Shaye. So they're on one side of it, condemning his trial as a sham, talking about who he actually was as a journalist. And on the other side of it, you have the dictatorship of Ali Abdullah Saleh, a specialized criminal tribunal set up to go after journalists, and the White House. And so President Obama is the single person keeping that man in prison right now, because even the dictator, Ali Abdullah Saleh, was prepared to release him. And it was a phone call, not from one of Obama's people, from Obama himself, that kept him in prison. And so when I called the State Department, one of the things I said is, what is the evidence that you have to support your contention that Abdulelah Haidar Shaye is a terrorist or is affiliated with al-Qaeda? And they said, we don't have anything to say on that right now. So that's how much of a sham this is. So anyone who wants to say, well, Obama must know what he's doing, needs to realize that you're taking a position against major human rights organizations and journalist organizations against the United States, which is currently engaged in its biggest crackdown on whistleblowers in history. So just be clear on what side of the line you're on if you're a journalist when you say that.
And Mohammed, the irony or the contradiction of the Obama administration trying to pressure other governments to free journalists, but here actually pressuring a government to keep a journalist in prison? Yeah,
I mean, the U.S. government has a record of pressuring authoritarian regimes to release journalists who are being held unjustly. This has happened many times and many times across this region. And then the problem is when you look at Yemen, we have this court that was designed and put in place only so that you can bludgeon journalists into submission. And this idea of a pardon after being convicted by this court, every single journalist that has been convicted by this court was eventually pardoned. So, they sentence you, they send a message to everybody else, and then you go to prison for a month or 2 or 3 or 4, and then when it's Eid or some religious holiday or something, they go, okay, pardons for everybody, and everybody just leaves. And it's supposed to be a slap on the wrist and don't forget who's boss here. Except in this case, it's spiraled totally out of control.
And also a question about WikiLeaks and what it has revealed.
I mean, WikiLeaks confirmed the kinds of things that Abdulelah Haidar Shaye was alleging, and that the U.S. and Yemeni governments had such a problem with being revealed, namely that the U.S. has this covert war in Yemen, and that it's actively conspired with the Yemeni government to cover up the American role, and that Yemen often takes credit for operations that are U.S. operations. The final point I would make about about this is that local journalists around the world, and in these cases, many of them are Arab journalists that no one's ever heard of, they get killed more than anyone else. They get wounded more than anyone else. They get imprisoned by these dictatorships more than anyone else. Without them, if their voices are silenced, we will not get anywhere near the complete picture of what's happening in these war zones, in these dictatorships. You see the bravery of citizen journalists in Syria. Abdulelah Haidar Shaye was a brave journalist. He just happened to be on the wrong side of history in the eyes of the U.S. And his crime seems to be interviewing the wrong people and having the audacity to publish another side of the story. That should be unacceptable to all journalists. His cause should be just as important as Roxana Saberi, who was arrested in Iran, and a huge international outcry was made for her. What about Abdulelah Haidar Shaye? He deserves the support of journalists around the world. He needs to be released from prison.